Lydia stood in the biodome and watched the morning light filter through the transparent panels above. The red desert stretched endlessly beyond the station, a landscape that seemed both beautiful and hostile at the same time. She had been at Station Alpha for 6 years now, and she still felt like an outsider sometimes, even though she had saved the colony more than once with her knowledge and her dragons. The 3 dragons were sleeping in their designated area. Vex lay curled up in the warmest corner, her crimson scales absorbing the heat lamps that kept the biodome at the right temperature. Kree was stretched out across the stone platform they had built for him, his midnight blue scales reflecting the artificial sunlight. Arya was smaller and more delicate, curled into a ball in her favorite sleeping position near the water feature they had installed. Lydia walked over to Vex first and ran her hand along the dragon's warm scales. Vex opened one eye and a small puff of smoke came from her nostrils. The dragon was content, peaceful. This was how Lydia liked to find them, comfortable and safe. She thought about the meeting that Commander Hall had called for later that morning. He wanted to discuss expanding the dragon's role in the research operations, and Lydia was not sure how she felt about that. The thing was, Lydia understood human nature very well. Humans had a tendency to want more, to push boundaries to see how far they could go. She had seen this behavior countless times in her long life. Elves lived for thousands of years and humans lived for only decades, which meant their priorities were different. They rushed through their existence trying to accomplish as much as possible before their time ran out. She could not blame them for this, but it made her cautious about what she allowed the dragons to do. She moved to Kree next and checked his wing membrane for any signs of damage. The blue dragon lifted his head and made a low rumbling sound that meant hello in dragon language. Kree was the intelligent one, the one who seemed to understand things that even Vex and Arya sometimes missed. He had recently started drawing symbols in the sand, symbols that Lydia recognized as ancient Elvish, though she could not understand how Kree had learned them. Perhaps it was encoded in their genetic memory, something passed down through the dragon species from ages past. Arya woke up when Lydia approached her. The golden dragon was always the most affectionate of the 3, constantly seeking physical contact and attention. Arya nuzzled into Lydia's hand and purred, a sound like distant thunder mixed with the purring of a cat. Lydia smiled and sat down beside the dragon, letting Arya rest her head on her lap. This moment, right here, was what mattered most to Lydia. Not the research, not the discoveries, not the expansion of human knowledge about distant worlds. What mattered was the connection she had with these 3 beings. Her communicator beeped, pulling her away from the moment. Commander Hall's voice came through, formal and professional as always. Lydia, when you get a chance, could you meet me in the conference room? We have some important matters to discuss about the dragon's future involvement in our operations. I have a few ideas that could really benefit the colony. Lydia closed her eyes for a moment before responding. I will be there in 30 minutes, Commander. Let me finish my morning routine with the dragons first. She took her time with the morning ritual. She fed all 3 dragons, making sure each one got the proper nutrition they needed. The food was specially formulated, combining elements from the original world where dragons had evolved with modern nutritional science. It was one of Lydia's greatest achievements, figuring out how to keep these ancient creatures healthy in such a modern, alien environment. After feeding them, she spent time grooming Vex, running a specialized brush through the dragon's scales to keep them healthy and shiny. Vex loved this activity, and would often fall into a peaceful sleep while Lydia worked. The other 2 dragons played together in the water feature, and Lydia could hear them chirping and making sounds that probably meant they were having fun. When she finally made her way to the conference room, she found Commander Hall waiting with 3 other people. There was Dr. Maria, the station's chief medical officer. There was James, the head of engineering and maintenance, and there was a face she did not recognize, someone new. Lydia, this is Dr. Robert Cross. He has just arrived from Earth on the supply ship. He is a leading expert in xenobiology and interspecies communication. We thought it would be valuable to have him consult on how we could better utilize the dragons in our research efforts. Dr. Cross stood up and extended his hand to shake hers. Lydia looked at his hand for a moment before taking it. His grip was firm but not aggressive. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with curiosity. She did not trust him, not yet, but she was willing to listen. Thank you for having me here, Dr. Cross said with a slight accent that suggested he was from the eastern regions of Earth. I have read all the reports about your dragons, and I must say, they are extraordinary creatures. The things they accomplished during the recent excavation were nothing short of remarkable, I believe with proper training and coordination. They could become integral to many of our operations here on the colony. Lydia sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. What exactly do you mean by proper training? She asked quietly. The dragons are clearly intelligent, Dr. Cross continued. They follow your commands and seem to understand complex tasks. With systematic training, we could expand their capabilities. They could help with mining operations, atmospheric research, maybe even defense if we ever needed it. They are a resource that we have not fully utilized. Lydia felt something cold settle in her chest. She did not like the way he said the word resource. It sounded like he saw the dragons as tools, as things to be used rather than beings to be respected. The dragons are not resources, Lydia said, her voice calm but firm. They are sentient creatures with their own thoughts, feelings, and preferences. They chose to help with the excavation because they wanted to, not because they were trained to obey commands. If we start forcing them into operations they do not choose, we will damage the trust we have built with them. Dr. Cross smiled, and it was not a kind smile. I understand your concern, but we need to be practical here. These are alien creatures on a distant world. We cannot afford to anthropomorphize them too much. They have capabilities that we need, and it would be foolish not to use them. Commander Hall cleared his throat. I think what Dr. Cross is suggesting is that we explore possibilities. We are not talking about forcing them to do anything they do not want to do, just maybe seeing if there are other ways they could help the colony. Lydia looked at the commander, trying to gauge his true feelings. She had known him for 6 years, and she thought she could trust him. But she was beginning to wonder if he agreed more with Dr. Cross than he was letting on. I will talk to the dragons about this, Lydia said. If they are interested in exploring new tasks and responsibilities, we can discuss it. But I will not push them into anything, and I will not allow them to be treated as anything less than the intelligent beings that they are. The meeting ended shortly after that. As Lydia walked back toward the biodome, she felt troubled. She had anticipated this moment since she first brought the eggs to the station. There would always be someone who saw the dragons as resources to be exploited. The question was whether Commander Hall would protect them or allow that exploitation to happen. That evening, Lydia sat with all 3 dragons in their private chamber. She explained the meeting to them in the way that elves communicate with dragons, through a combination of words and emotion that conveyed meaning at a deeper level than simple language. Vex was the first to react. The red dragon stood up and moved toward the door, as if ready to confront whoever might try to control them. Kree was more thoughtful, his blue scales flickering with what Lydia interpreted as concern. Arya moved closer to Lydia, seeking comfort. Lydia had spent her entire life teaching other species to respect the dragons, but she was beginning to realize that no amount of teaching could truly change the fundamental nature of those who saw other beings as things to be used. She would have to remain vigilant, would have to protect her dragons from those who did not understand that true intelligence deserved true freedom. The red planet seemed to watch from outside the biodome, ancient and patient, as Lydia made a silent promise to her dragons. Whatever came next, she would face it with them. She would not allow them to become servants or slaves to human ambition. They had chosen to come to this world, and they would remain free to choose their own path forward. Outside, the station continued its rotation, and the vast universe stretched endlessly around them. Somewhere in that vastness there were answers to questions Lydia had not even thought to ask yet. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by her dragons, she felt at peace. She felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she needed to do. The next morning brought complications. Lydia woke to find a message on her communicator from Dr. Cross requesting a private meeting in the research laboratory. She did not want to meet with him alone, but she also knew that refusing would only create more tension. She decided to go, but she told Vex to stay close and alert. The dragon could monitor her through the special link they shared, and if Lydia was in danger, Vex would know. The research laboratory occupied the central hub of Station Alpha. It was a vast space filled with equipment, computers, and specimens from all over the red planet. Dr. Cross was waiting near the dragon specimen storage unit, looking at the samples they had collected over the years. He turned when Lydia entered, and his expression was pleasant, but his eyes were calculating. I wanted to speak with you privately about something important, he said without preamble. I have been reviewing the genetic data of your dragons, and I found something quite remarkable. Their DNA contains markers that suggest they were artificially created at some point in their evolutionary history. They were designed, not naturally evolved. Do you understand what that means? Lydia felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her face neutral. Yes, I understand. What is your point, Doctor? If they were designed, then they are tools. They were created with a specific purpose in mind. Someone, thousands of years ago, created these dragons to do certain things, to serve certain functions. It is entirely reasonable that we use them for the purposes they were designed for. You are wrong, Lydia said quietly. The fact that they were designed does not make them less worthy of freedom or respect. They are still conscious beings with agency, and you cannot possibly know what they were originally designed for. Evolution and experience change creatures. After thousands of years, they have become something more than their original programming. Dr. Cross smiled again, and Lydia realized that this man enjoyed conflict. He enjoyed trying to convince people to see things his way. He probably thought he was a visionary, someone ahead of his time. In reality, he was simply someone who saw living beings as objects to be manipulated. You are idealistic, he said. It is admirable but impractical. Humanity has limited resources here. We need to maximize every advantage we have. The dragons are an advantage that we cannot afford to waste on sentimental feelings about freedom and rights. If you try to force my dragons to do anything against their will, I will report you to the Earth Council, Lydia said. And more importantly, I will make sure that every decision you make and every order you give is questioned and documented. The dragons have value precisely because they choose to help us. Force them, and you will only have creatures that resent being here and will not cooperate with any of your plans. Dr. Cross leaned against the counter, studying her with those calculating eyes. You are more intelligent than I gave you credit for, but that also makes you more dangerous. Powerful people usually are. He walked toward the door and paused before leaving. I hope you understand that this is not personal. It is simply science. We study things. We understand them. And we use that understanding to improve our world. Your dragons are part of that process, whether you like it or not. After he left, Lydia stood alone in the laboratory for a long moment. She could feel Vex's anxiety through their link. The dragon wanted her to come back to the biodome immediately. Lydia made her way back slowly, thinking about what Dr. Cross had said. He was not wrong about one thing. Humanity did have a tendency to study, understand, and use things. It was part of their nature. The question was whether Lydia could work within that system, or whether she would need to resist it. When she reached the biodome, all three dragons were agitated. Vex moved in circles. Kree was making sharp clicking sounds and Arya was huddled in the corner. Lydia immediately moved to comfort them, understanding that they had sensed her stress through their connection. It is okay, she told them. He cannot do anything without my permission, and I will not give it. But even as she said the words, she was not entirely sure they were true. Dr. Cross had power here. He had authority from Earth, credentials that impressed the other scientists. Commander Hall might side with him if pushed. And what could Lydia really do? She was one elf and three dragons. Against the entire human establishment, they were vulnerable. Over the next few days, Dr. Cross began subtly pressuring the other scientists. He would casually mention how useful the dragons could be for various projects. He would speak about the potential benefits in meetings. He was building a case, constructing an argument that would make it seem reasonable and logical to use the dragons more intensively. Lydia recognized the strategy. She had seen it used countless times across the centuries. Commander Hall called another meeting, this time with a larger group. Dr. Cross was there along with most of the senior staff. The commander presented a proposal for a new research initiative that would expand the dragons' involvement in several different areas of colony operations. He was diplomatic about it, never saying that the dragons would be forced to do anything. Instead, he asked if Lydia thought the dragons might be interested in exploring these opportunities. Lydia knew what was happening. This was the civilized way of trying to force her hand. If she said no, she would be seen as obstructing progress and being selfish with valuable resources. If she said yes, she would be opening the door for the dragons to be increasingly exploited. I need to consult with the dragons first, she said, but I have concerns about how this would be implemented. The dragons are not machines. They are living beings with emotions and needs. Overwork could harm them. Dr. Cross interjected smoothly. Of course, which is why we have consulted with Dr. Maria about their health requirements. The new work schedule would not exceed safe parameters. Everything would be monitored carefully. Lydia felt like she was being boxed in. She could not say no without appearing unreasonable. But if she said yes, she would be allowing the dragons to become overworked and stressed. There had to be another way, but she could not see it right now. After the meeting, she went back to the biodome and explained the situation to the dragons. She was honest about the pressure, the political maneuvering, and the danger of what might happen if they refused. Vex stood and walked to the window, looking out at the red desert. The dragon made a sound that was both angry and sorrowful. Kree moved to Lydia's side and pressed against her, offering comfort. Arya simply waited, trusting Lydia to figure out what to do. That night, Lydia did not sleep. She sat in the quiet of the biodome and thought about her options. She could demand that the dragons be recognized as citizens with legal rights, but that would take time and might fail. She could request a transfer off the station for all of them. But where would they go? The rest of humanity was not necessarily more enlightened than these colonists. She could also fight. She could refuse to cooperate, create incidents that would show that using the dragons against their will was counterproductive. But that might put the dragons in danger, and she could not accept that risk. As dawn broke over the red planet, Lydia made a decision. She would play along with some of the proposals, but she would set clear boundaries and limits. She would observe carefully to see if Dr. Cross was genuinely interested in the dragons' welfare, or if he was simply trying to exploit them, and she would prepare the dragons for the possibility that they might need to leave this colony and find another home. She called Commander Hall and told him that the dragons were willing to explore some limited new tasks, but she specified that they would work no more than a few hours a day, that they would have complete freedom to refuse any task, and that she would have veto power over any activity that might harm them. The commander agreed, though she could hear the disappointment in his voice. He had probably hoped for more. When Lydia told the dragons about this compromise, they accepted it with what seemed like resignation. They understood that the universe was not always fair or just. They had lived long enough to know that sometimes you had to navigate the world as it was, not as you wished it to be. Over the following week, the dragons began participating in limited research activities. They helped with geological surveys, where their unique sensory abilities allowed them to detect things that human instruments could not. They assisted with atmospheric monitoring, their wings helping to collect samples from higher altitudes. The work was not harmful, and the dragons seemed to take some interest in it. But Lydia watched Dr. Cross carefully. He was always looking for more, always trying to push the boundaries just a little further. Each request was slightly more demanding than the last. It was like being slowly boiled in water, the temperature increasing so gradually that you did not notice until it was too late. One afternoon, Dr. Cross asked if the dragons could help with a deep drilling operation at a site that had shown some unusual seismic activity. It was the same type of work they had done before. But Lydia noticed something different about the request. There was a desperate edge to Dr. Cross's voice, as if something important depended on this particular task. Lydia spent most of the night analyzing the data that Dr. Cross had given her. The signals were faint but consistent, coming from approximately 3 kilometers below the surface. They had a pattern to them, a rhythm that suggested intentional transmission rather than natural phenomenon. This was significant. This meant that at some point in time, an intelligent species had either been on this planet or had left technology here that was still functioning. By morning, she had reached a decision. She would take the dragons to investigate, but she would do it carefully, documenting everything and ensuring that they understood what they were walking into. More importantly, she would make absolutely certain that this was done with the dragons' full consent and understanding. They would not be tools or servants. They would be partners in discovery. She told Commander Hall about her decision and requested that Dr. Cross not be present for the initial exploration. The commander was surprised by this request, but he agreed. Lydia suspected that he understood there was a delicate balance here, and pushing too hard would break it entirely. She prepared the dragons carefully. She explained what they knew about the signals, what they might find, and what the potential risks could be. She made it clear that they could refuse, that there was no judgment if they chose not to go. She was shocked when all 3 dragons immediately agreed without hesitation. Vex was excited, her crimson scales seeming to glow brighter. Kree was thoughtful but determined. Arya, surprisingly, was the most enthusiastic of them all. The golden dragon made sounds that seemed to express adventure and curiosity. The expedition began at dawn. Lydia led the 3 dragons to the drilling site where they had worked before. The engineers had prepared a shaft and had reinforced it to handle the dragon's weight. As they descended deeper into the planet, the temperature rose and the air became thinner. But the dragons were not bothered by these conditions. At a depth of 3 kilometers, Lydia directed the dragons to move carefully and deliberately. She wanted them to excavate slowly, revealing whatever was below layer by layer. Vex used her claws to remove stone carefully. Kree used his thermal senses to identify the strongest parts of the structure they were uncovering. Arya helped clear debris with surprising precision and delicacy for such a large creature. After several hours of work, a structure began to emerge from the rock. It was metallic and smooth, clearly artificial. It was not human technology. The material was something Lydia had never seen before. It had properties that seemed to shimmer between solid and semi-transparent, and it hummed with that same signal that the sensors had been detecting. Lydia placed her hand on the structure, and immediately she felt something extraordinary. The metal was warm and responsive to her touch. It seemed to recognize her. And suddenly information flooded into her mind. Images, knowledge, understanding that had been encoded into this technology thousands of years ago. She gasped and pulled her hand back, overwhelmed by the rush of information. Vex and Kree immediately moved to her side, concerned that she was hurt. But Lydia was not hurt. She was transformed. She had just made contact with an ancient civilization that had once visited this planet. Slowly, she began to understand. The dragons themselves were connected to this civilization. Their DNA had been modified by the ancients, designed specifically to interact with this technology. The dragons were not random creatures brought to life by ancient magic or evolution. They were engineered to be guardians and interpreters of this ancient knowledge. Lydia began to work with the structure more deliberately. She asked the dragons to help her uncover more of it. As they worked, the technology began to respond more actively. Lights appeared in its surface, patterns that seemed to convey meaning. Kree made sounds of recognition, as if he understood the language of the ancient device. Vex and Arya moved in sync with the structure, as if responding to commands they could somehow sense. After several more hours, they had exposed enough of the structure to see that it was some kind of recording device or memory storage system. Lydia understood that she could access the information, but she needed to be careful. Accessing it could trigger responses that might be dangerous. She decided to bring the dragons back to the surface and discuss this discovery with them properly. They had a right to know what they were part of before proceeding further. Back in the biodome, Lydia explained to the dragons what she had learned. She told them that they were more than just ordinary creatures. They were guardians of an ancient legacy, descendants of a genetic lineage that spanned thousands of years. The ancients had created them to be intelligent, powerful, and capable of understanding complex technology. The question now was what they wanted to do with that knowledge. The dragons seemed to process this information differently than Lydia expected. They did not seem surprised or shocked. Instead, they seemed to recognize it as something they had always known on a deep level but had never quite understood. Vex made low sounds that conveyed acceptance. Kree seemed contemplative, as if accessing memories that had been encoded into his genetic structure. Arya simply rubbed against Lydia, offering comfort and reassurance. That evening, Lydia called a meeting with Commander Hall and revealed part of what they had discovered. She told him about the ancient device, but she was vague about the dragon's specific connection to it. She said that the dragon's unique abilities made them invaluable for understanding the ancient technology, but that all further investigation would proceed at their pace and with their consent. The commander seemed satisfied with this explanation. Dr. Cross, however, was not satisfied. He demanded detailed reports and pushed for more intensive investigation. He wanted the dragons to work longer hours to extract more data from the device. His obsession with the ancient technology seemed to border on manic. Lydia realized that she needed to be very careful. Dr. Cross represented a danger not just to the dragons but to the entire colony. If he became obsessed enough with accessing the ancient technology, he might do something reckless that could have catastrophic consequences. She called a private meeting with Kree and explained her concerns. She asked the Blue Dragon if he could sense anything about the ancient technology, anything that might suggest what it was truly designed to do. Kree made sounds that seemed to describe complex concepts. Through their connection, Lydia understood that the ancient device was not just a storage system. It was a trigger. It was designed to initiate something when the dragons recognized the right conditions. The ancients had left it here as a safeguard or a summons, a way of communicating across the vast distances of space and time. Lydia realized that activating this device could potentially summon the ancient civilization back to this planet, or it could trigger some automated system that had been waiting for thousands of years. The risk was enormous, and she could not allow Dr. Cross to proceed without understanding what he might be unleashing. She decided to make her move. She went to Commander Hall and requested an emergency meeting. She told him everything she knew about the ancient device, about the dragon's connection to it, and about the danger of proceeding without careful consideration of the consequences. The commander listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You are asking me to shut down the investigation," he said finally. "No," Lydia replied. "I am asking you to proceed with extreme caution. I am asking you to put controls in place to ensure that we do not accidentally trigger something that we cannot control. And I am asking you to remove Dr. Cross from the research team. He is too focused on accessing the technology and not focused enough on understanding the risks." Commander Hall sighed heavily. "You realize that asking me to remove a scientist based on my concerns is a significant request. I would need documented evidence of misconduct or negligence." "Then we will have to create that evidence," Lydia said quietly. "The next time Dr. Cross overreaches or acts recklessly, I will document it. I will make sure there is a clear record of his behavior." She stood to leave, but the commander's voice stopped her. "If you are right about the risk, if this technology is truly as dangerous as you suggest, then maybe the best course of action would be to bury it again." "To leave it undisturbed, perhaps," Lydia agreed. "But that is not a decision we should make hastily. We should study it carefully first, understand what it is before deciding whether to keep it accessible or seal it away forever." Over the next week, Lydia and the dragons continued to work at the site, but much more slowly than Dr. Cross wanted. They gathered data, documented findings, and tried to understand more about the ancient device without activating it. The dragons seemed to be teaching Lydia their genetic memory, helping her understand concepts that no human mind had considered before. It was during this time that Lydia made a discovery that changed everything. The ancient device was not just a trigger or a communication tool. It was a gift. The ancients had left knowledge encoded within it, knowledge about medicine, technology, energy production, and countless other fields. They had left it for whoever emerged on this planet as an intelligent species, as a way of sharing their wisdom across the ages. The confrontation came sooner than Lydia expected. Dr. Cross, growing impatient with the slow pace of investigation, bypassed all the safety protocols and attempted to access the ancient device directly. He did this in the middle of the night when he thought no one would notice. But Lydia had stationed Kree outside the drilling site specifically to monitor for such an event. When Kree sensed the doctor tampering with the device, the dragon immediately alerted Lydia through their connection. She rushed from the biodome, her heart pounding. Vex and Aria followed close behind, understanding that something serious was happening. By the time Lydia reached the shaft, Dr. Cross had already inserted some kind of probe into the device. The ancient technology was beginning to respond, lights flickering across its surface in patterns that seemed increasingly erratic. Lydia could feel something building, a pressure that seemed to come from the device itself. She descended into the shaft as quickly as she could and found Dr. Cross standing before the device, his face illuminated by its otherworldly glow. He turned when he sensed her arrival, and there was something wild and desperate in his eyes. "I had to do it," he said, his voice shaking. "Do you understand how important this is? We cannot let this knowledge remain inaccessible. The human race deserves what the ancients have left for us." Lydia moved carefully toward him. "I know you believe that, but you do not understand what you are doing. This device has safeguards, protocols designed to protect it. You are triggering something that was meant to remain dormant." The device's hum grew louder and Lydia felt the pressure intensify. She could sense panic from Vex and Aria above, and even Kree seemed unsettled by whatever was happening. Lydia placed her hand on Dr. Cross's shoulder. "We need to leave. Now, this is not safe." But Dr. Cross resisted. "I came here to do research to advance human knowledge. I will not leave until I understand what this device does." The device suddenly flared with brilliant light and information began to stream across its surface. Lydia recognized the pattern immediately. It was not activating a weapon or a defense system. It was beginning to transmit information into space, sending a signal that would reach across the vast distances of the cosmos. The doctor had accidentally triggered a distress call or a summons. The ancient civilization would know that their device had been accessed. They would know that new intelligent life had emerged on this world. And they would respond. The question was how they would respond and when. Lydia grabbed Dr. Cross and pulled him toward the exit. The dragons were descending into the shaft now. moving with purpose and urgency. Vex reached down with her massive claws and carefully grabbed both Lydia and Dr. Cross, lifting them upward with surprising gentleness for such a powerful creature. As they reached the surface, Lydia looked back at the device one final time. The signal continued to pulse upward, seeking its audience among the stars. She turned to Dr. Cross and her expression was grave. "Do you understand what you have done? You have announced our presence to a civilization that may not remember us kindly. You have sent a signal across space that will take years to reach its destination, but once it does, everything could change." Dr. Cross looked stricken. "But you said the knowledge would help us. You said the ancients left it as a gift." "I said they left it for us to discover when we were ready," Lydia replied. "I did not say we were ready. I did not say we had the wisdom to receive it safely." She took him to Commander Hall and reported what had happened. The commander's reaction was swift and decisive. Dr. Cross was placed under immediate suspension pending investigation. The drilling site was sealed and access was restricted to Lydia and the dragons only. The colony fell into a state of anxious anticipation. Everyone understood that something significant had occurred, though the details were kept restricted to command personnel. Rumors spread through the station like wildfire. Some people were excited, imagining the technologies and knowledge that might come from the ancients. Others were terrified, worried about invasion or hostile contact. Lydia spent the next several days with the dragons, trying to understand what would happen next. She accessed the genetic memories that the dragons carried, seeking guidance from the ancient knowledge encoded within their very structure. It was like reading a library written in DNA, each memory a chapter of a history that spanned millennia. What she learned was both fascinating and terrifying. The ancients had indeed visited this planet thousands of years ago. They had been explorers and scientists, fascinated by the potential they saw in this world. They had created the dragons as a way of ensuring that future intelligent species would have a guide and mentor, a being that could bridge the gap between their technology and the level of understanding that new species possessed. But the ancients had also left warnings. They understood that technology without wisdom was dangerous. They understood that some civilizations would try to weaponize their gifts or use them for conquest. So they had built protocols into the device, safeguards that would allow it to evaluate the worthiness of those who sought to access it. The signal that Dr. Cross had triggered was not simply a distress call or a summons. It was a message that would alert the ancients that someone was trying to access their gift. It would take many years for that message to reach them, traveling at light speed across the vast distances between the stars. But when it did arrive, they would send back a response, a judgment of whether humanity was ready for what they had left behind. Lydia realized that she and the dragons now had an enormous responsibility. They would need to demonstrate that humanity could be wise with power, that they could handle advanced knowledge with maturity and compassion. If they failed to make that demonstration, the ancient civilization might decide that humanity was not worthy of their legacy. They might even decide to ensure that humanity never became a threat to other civilizations by removing them entirely. She called a meeting with Commander Hall and laid out what she had learned. She explained the timeline, the risks, and the potential consequences. She told him that she believed the best course of action would be to establish strict protocols for the ancient device, to ensure that it was approached with the utmost care and respect. The commander listened to everything she said, and then he asked her a question that she had been asking herself. "What do you think the ancients will decide? Do you think they will judge us as worthy?" Lydia took a long moment to answer. "I think it depends on us. I think the signal will take years to reach them, and during that time we will need to prove that we can handle power responsibly. We will need to show that we value the dragons not as tools but as partners. We will need to demonstrate wisdom and restraint. And if we fail to show those things," she continued, "then the ancients might decide that we are not ready. They might seal the device forever, or they might take more drastic measures to ensure that we do not become a threat to the rest of the galaxy." Commander Hall nodded slowly. "Then we had better begin immediately. I will work with the Council on establishing proper protocols. I will make sure that the dragons' rights and autonomy are recognized in the colony charter, and I will personally ensure that Dr. Cross understands the gravity of his actions." Over the following weeks, changes began to ripple through the colony. The dragons were officially recognized as sentient beings with full rights and protections under colony law. New research protocols were established that required explicit consent from any sentient being involved in research activities. Dr. Cross was eventually released from suspension, but was required to submit all research proposals for review by a committee that included Lydia and representatives from the dragon species. It was not a perfect solution, but it was a beginning. Lydia understood that the battle to protect the dragons and to ensure that technology was used wisely would be ongoing. There would always be those who saw living beings as resources to be exploited. There would always be those who wanted to push boundaries and take risks. But now at least there were protections in place. Now at least, the dragons had a voice in the decisions that affected them. One evening, as Lydia stood in the observation deck with all 3 dragons, she reflected on how far they had come. Vex rested her massive head on Lydia's shoulder. Kree stood beside her, his blue scales reflecting the light of the red planet below. Arya purred softly, content and peaceful. "I hope the ancients see what we are trying to become," Lydia said softly to them. "I hope they see that we are capable of wisdom, even if we have to learn it the hard way." The dragons seemed to understand her meaning. They had faith that their human partners could grow, could learn, could become worthy of the knowledge and power that the ancients had left behind. And as long as the dragons had faith, Lydia would continue to fight for them, to protect them, and to ensure that they remained free to choose their own destiny. 2 years passed, and Station Alpha underwent a transformation. The colony expanded, but not in the way that purely commercial interests would have directed. Instead, the expansion was guided by a philosophy of balance between human ambition and environmental responsibility. The dragons had become integral to this philosophy, serving as advisors and partners in decision-making processes. Lydia had been appointed as the official liaison between the dragon species and the human colony administration. It was a position of significant authority and responsibility. She worked with Kree on establishing a comprehensive education program that would teach colony residents about dragon culture and dragon cognition. Vex had become involved in environmental monitoring, her unique sensory capabilities making her invaluable in tracking changes to the planet's ecosystem. Arya, surprisingly, had taken an interest in human culture and spent time learning languages and studying the history of humanity's expansion across the galaxy. The ancient device remained sealed, but Lydia visited it regularly to monitor its status. She had learned to communicate with it on a basic level, understanding its functions without activating its more dangerous protocols. Through this communication, she had discovered that the device was indeed waiting for a response, a way of evaluating whether the signal it had sent would eventually reach the ancients. The device could measure the ethical development of the human colony, could assess whether the inhabitants were growing wiser and more compassionate. It seemed to be satisfied so far. The barriers it had erected to prevent further accidental activation had not been triggered. The signal it had sent continued its journey through space, carrying with it the message that a new intelligent species had emerged, and that they possessed at least enough wisdom to handle the knowledge entrusted to them. Commander Hall had eventually retired and returned to Earth, replaced by Commander Linda Ross, who had been educated about the true situation before her arrival. She was progressive and thoughtful, someone who understood that the future of human civilization depended on developing a more mature and ethical approach to encountering other intelligent species. The colony had also begun receiving regular transmissions from Earth, though the communication delay meant that messages took weeks to travel in either direction. The Earth Council was deeply interested in the dragons and in the ancient device. They wanted to send more scientists, more researchers, more people to study and learn, but Lydia insisted on strict protocols. Any new arrivals would need to be vetted not just for their scientific credentials, but for their ethical frameworks and their ability to respect the autonomy of sentient beings. Some of these potential arrivals were rejected. Others were welcomed but placed under close observation. Lydia had become protective of Station Alpha in a way that surprised even herself. This was no longer just a colony for human advancement. It had become a sanctuary, a place where a different way of thinking was being tested and proven viable. 3 years after the signal had been sent, Lydia received a message through the ancient device. It was faint and took weeks to decode properly, but the meaning became clear. The ancients acknowledged the signal. They understood that humans had made contact with the device they had left behind, and they were pleased by what they sensed from the colony. The message conveyed that the ancients would be monitoring human development. They would send periodic signals of their own, checking in to see how the colony progressed. If humans could demonstrate continued ethical development over several generations, if they could show that they were capable of sharing power and resources with other intelligent species, then the ancients would consider revealing themselves fully. They might even consider sharing more of their advanced knowledge, not through the device but through direct interaction. Lydia shared this message with Commander Ross and with the Earth Council. The implications were staggering. Humanity had always seen itself as the pinnacle of intelligence in the galaxy, the dominant species that would eventually reach out and shape the cosmos according to human values and desires. Now they were being told that there were older, wiser civilizations watching them, evaluating them, essentially placing humanity on probation, until they could prove they were mature enough to be trusted with greater knowledge and power. The response from Earth was mixed. Some people were excited about the prospect of contact with an advanced civilization. Others were fearful. Still others were skeptical, wondering if the entire situation was some kind of hoax or manipulation. But the Council ultimately agreed with Lydia's assessment that the best approach was to continue, building on the ethical foundation that had already begun to develop on Station Alpha. Research began on understanding how to eventually communicate directly with the ancients, should the opportunity arise. But it was slow, careful work. Lydia and the dragons worked alongside human scientists, making sure that every decision was made with an awareness of the broader implications. 5 years after the signal had been sent, something unexpected occurred. A ship appeared in the planet's orbital space. It was not a human ship, and it was not responding to standard communication protocols. For a terrifying moment, the colony held its breath, wondering if the ancients had decided humanity was not worth saving and had sent a weapon. But Commander Ross was calm. She ordered that the ship be welcomed rather than treated as a threat. She requested that Lydia and the dragons come to the communication center to assist with making contact. The ship descended slowly and landed near the colony. For hours, nothing happened. Then the landing ramp opened and a figure emerged. It was not what anyone on the colony had expected. The being was roughly humanoid, but with features that suggested a completely different evolutionary history. Her skin seemed to shimmer between colors, and her eyes held an intelligence so vast and ancient that looking directly at them felt like staring into deep space. "I am Ambassador Kale." The being said through speakers that the human communication system translated into comprehensible speech. "I represent the collective consciousness that left the device on your world generations ago. We have come to assess whether your species is ready for the next stage of development." Lydia moved forward, her pointed ears catching subtle frequencies in the ambassador's speech that told her this being was far older than she had ever imagined. The 3 dragons moved beside her, and Kale's expression changed immediately upon seeing them. "You have preserved the Guardians," Kyle said, and for the first time there seemed to be emotion in the ambassador's voice. "We had hoped you would, but we were not certain. The Guardians are the key to everything. They are the bridge between species, the embodiment of the principle that all intelligent beings deserve respect and autonomy." Kale approached the dragons carefully and performed a gesture that Lydia recognized from her genetic memory as an ancient form of greeting. Vex, Kree, and Arya responded instinctively, moving into patterns that seemed choreographed despite never having been taught those specific movements. The genetic memory encoded within them recognized something ancient and familiar in the ambassador. "What happens now?" Commander Ross asked carefully. The ambassador turned to face the human commander. "Now we begin the process of genuine integration. Your species has shown more ethical development in a short time than most younger species demonstrate in centuries. You have learned to respect the autonomy of other beings. You have resisted the urge to exploit resources thoughtlessly. You have built a society here where different species work together as partners rather than masters and servants." Kale gestured to the dragons. "The Guardians will work with you to access the knowledge that was left in the device. The process will be slow and deliberate. You will be given technologies and understanding one piece at a time, evaluated between each stage to ensure you are ready for the next. This is not punishment. It is protection. Knowledge without wisdom has destroyed countless civilizations. We will help you avoid that fate." The ambassador spent the following weeks on Station Alpha, working with Lydia and the dragons to establish protocols for accessing the ancient knowledge. She explained that there were other civilizations in the galaxy, many of them far older than humanity. Some were benevolent and sought to help younger species develop. Others were hostile or indifferent to the welfare of other species. The ancient civilization that had left the device wanted to ensure that humanity could survive and eventually thrive in a galaxy filled with countless types of beings, each with their own agendas and philosophies. When Kale finally prepared to leave, she took Lydia aside and spoke to her privately. "You have done something remarkable here," the ambassador said. "You have taught humans to value compassion over exploitation, cooperation over domination. This is rare among young species. Most of them are driven by fear and greed, but you and the dragons have shown that another way is possible. The ancients are pleased by this. They believe your species has great potential." Lydia felt the weight of that responsibility, but she also felt hope. The future was uncertain, but it was no longer dictated solely by human ambition or by the fear of the unknown. There was a path forward, a way to grow and develop that honored the dignity of all intelligent beings.